3 days had passed since the market, and Thomas was working late in his barn, repairing a broken fence post by lantern light. The autumn evening had grown cold, and a thick fog was rolling in from the valley below. He could barely see past his own fence line, but he wasn't worried. After 30 years on this land, he could find his way around blindfolded. As Thomas hammered the final nail into the wooden post, he heard something that made him freeze. It was a woman's voice, high and desperate, cutting through the misty air like a knife. She was screaming for help, and the sound was coming from the direction of the old mill road, about half a mile from his property. Thomas dropped his hammer and listened carefully. There it was again, definitely a woman in serious trouble. Without hesitation, he grabbed his lantern and the heavy walking stick he used when checking on cattle in the far pastures. His heart was already pounding as he started running toward the sound. The fog made everything look different. Trees appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The familiar path seemed foreign and dangerous. But Thomas pressed forward, guided by the woman's continued cries for help. Each scream seemed more desperate than the last, and he could hear the fear in her voice even from a distance. As he got closer to the mill road, Thomas could make out other sounds, men's voices, rough and threatening, the sound of horses snorting and stamping their feet, the creak of carriage wheels. Something was very wrong here, and Thomas knew he was walking into danger. He slowed down and moved more carefully, using the fog as cover. Through the mist, he could see the outline of an elegant carriage stopped in the middle of the road. One of the wheels had come off, and the carriage was tilted at an awkward angle. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 men on horseback had surrounded the carriage. Even in the dim light, Thomas could see they were armed with swords and knives. These weren't ordinary travelers. They were bandits who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. A broken-down carriage, a helpless passenger, and a perfect hiding spot in the fog. Inside the carriage, Thomas could see a young woman pressed against the far corner. She was wearing fine clothes and jewelry that sparkled even in the weak light from his lantern. This was clearly a lady of noble birth, probably traveling between her family's estates. The bandits had found themselves a very valuable prize. "Please," the woman was saying, her voice shaking with terror. "Take whatever you want, but don't hurt me. My father will pay whatever ransom you ask." The largest of the 3 bandits laughed coldly. "Oh, we'll take everything, my lady. Your jewelry, your money, and maybe a few other things too." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Thomas felt his blood run cold. Thomas knew he should turn around and ride to town for help. 3 armed men against 1 farmer with a walking stick. It wasn't a fair fight by any measure, but the woman's terrified sobs cut straight to his heart. By the time help arrived from town, it would be too late. Whatever these men planned to do, they would do it quickly and disappear into the night. For just a moment, Thomas thought about his quiet life on the ranch. He thought about his cattle who depended on him. He thought about the safe routine of his days. All of that could end right here if he made the wrong choice. But then he heard the woman cry out again, and he knew he couldn't live with himself if he walked away. Thomas set down his lantern and moved closer. Staying hidden behind a large oak tree, he could see the situation more clearly now. 2 of the bandits had dismounted and were approaching the carriage. The 3rd man stayed on his horse, keeping watch on the road. Their own horses were nervous in the fog, dancing and pulling at their reins. The woman tried to climb out the opposite side of the carriage, but one of the bandits caught her arm and pulled her back. "No need to run, my lady," he said with a cruel smile. "We're all going to get to know each other very well." That was enough for Thomas. He had heard all he needed to hear. Moving as quietly as possible, Thomas circled around behind the bandits' horses. The animals were already spooked by the fog and the tension in the air. It wouldn't take much to panic them completely. He picked up a handful of small stones and threw them hard at the horses' legs. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. The horses reared and whinnied in fear, pulling so hard that 2 of them broke free from where they had been tied to a tree branch. The bandit who had stayed mounted was thrown to the ground as his horse bolted into the fog. The other two men spun around, trying to figure out what had happened. "What was that?" one of them shouted. "Did you hear something?" "The horses are spooked," the second bandit replied, drawing his sword. "Someone's out there?" Thomas used their confusion to his advantage. While the bandits were looking in the wrong direction, he charged out of the fog with his walking stick raised high. The first bandit turned just in time to see Thomas swinging the heavy wooden stick toward his head. The man tried to duck, but Thomas's aim was true. The stick connected with a solid thunk, and the bandit collapsed to the ground. The second bandit reacted quickly, slashing at Thomas with his knife. The blade caught Thomas across the shoulder, tearing through his shirt and leaving a burning line of pain. But Thomas had spent decades doing hard physical work. His arms and shoulders were strong from years of lifting hay bales and wrestling cattle. He ignored the pain and swung his stick again. This time the bandit was ready for him. He grabbed the stick with his free hand and tried to pull it away from Thomas. The two men struggled for control, grunting and straining against each other. The bandit was younger and had a knife, but Thomas had desperation on his side. He was fighting for something more important than his own life. The third bandit had recovered from his fall and was getting back on his feet. Thomas could see him reaching for his sword, and he knew he only had seconds before the odds turned against him completely. With a surge of strength he didn't know he had, Thomas twisted the walking stick out of the second bandit's grip and struck him hard across the ribs. The man doubled over in pain, gasping for breath. Thomas didn't waste the opportunity. He brought the stick down again, this time across the bandit's back. The man fell to his knees, his knife clattering across the stone road, but the third bandit was now armed and advancing on Thomas. This man was bigger than the other two, with scars on his face that showed he had been in many fights before. He moved his sword with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "You made a big mistake, farmer," the scarred bandit said, raising his weapon. "Should have minded your own business." Thomas was breathing hard, and he could feel warm blood running down his arm from the knife wound. His walking stick felt heavy in his hands. But behind him he could hear the young woman whispering prayers, and he knew he couldn't give up now. The bandit lunged forward with his sword, aiming for Thomas's chest. But Thomas had been watching the man's eyes, and he saw the attack coming. He stepped to the side and swung his stick with all his remaining strength. The wood crashed into the bandit's wrist, and the sword went flying into the darkness. Before the man could recover, Thomas tackled him to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, each trying to get the upper hand. The bandit was stronger, but Thomas was fighting for his life and for the life of an innocent woman. Somehow, that made all the difference. When the struggle was finally over, all three bandits were unconscious or too injured to continue fighting. Thomas stood in the middle of the road, swaying on his feet, his clothes torn and bloody. The fog was starting to lift, and he could see the young woman climbing carefully out of her damaged carriage. She was even younger than he had thought, probably no more than 20. Her fine dress was wrinkled and torn from her ordeal, and there were tears streaming down her face. But she was alive and unharmed, and that was all that mattered to Thomas. The young lady had thanked Thomas with tears in her eyes that foggy night, calling him her savior before her father's guards arrived to escort her safely home. Thomas had simply tipped his worn hat, gathered his walking stick, and disappeared back into the mist toward his ranch. He expected nothing more from the encounter than the satisfaction of having done what was right, or by the next morning, word of the rescue had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. And with each telling, the story grew more twisted and ugly. Thomas discovered this when he arrived at the market with his usual load of vegetables. The moment he stepped into the town square, he noticed something was different. People were staring at him more than usual, and there was whispering everywhere he went. Small groups would fall silent when he passed, then burst into animated conversation the moment he was out of earshot. He set up his stall in his regular spot, but within minutes he understood that this was not going to be an ordinary market day. A well-dressed merchant from the other side of the square walked over, followed by several other shopkeepers. Their faces wore expressions of disgust and suspicion. "So," the merchant said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear, We heard about your little adventure on the mill road. Thomas looked up from arranging his vegetables. If you're talking about helping that young lady, then yes. 3. Bandits had attacked her carriage. The merchant laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh, that's your story, is it? A simple farmer just happened to fight off 3 armed bandits all by himself? Other people began gathering around Thomas's stall. He could see doubt and mockery in their faces. What should have been recognition for a brave act was turning into something completely different. Seems mighty convenient, said another voice. From the crowd, a rancher who can barely afford decent clothes suddenly becomes a hero, fighting off bandits like some kind of knight. An elderly woman pushed her way to the front of the group. I've known men like this all my life, she declared, with authority. They create problems just so they can solve them. Mark my words, this whole thing was planned from the start. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Planned? Ma'am, I was just fixing fence posts when I heard her screaming for help. Oh, you heard her screaming, the merchant repeated mockingly. How convenient that you just happened to be nearby. How convenient that you just happened to have the right tools to fight off 3 grown men. The crowd was growing larger, and Thomas could see that many people were nodding in agreement with these accusations. The story they were telling themselves made sense to them. A simple farmer couldn't possibly be a hero. There had to be some other explanation. Maybe he arranged the whole thing with those bandits, suggested a young man whose father owned the largest store in town, split the ransom money 3 ways after making himself look like a hero. Or maybe, said a woman in an expensive hat, lowering her voice dramatically, maybe his intentions weren't pure at all. Maybe he wanted to be alone with that young lady for his own reasons. This suggestion hit Thomas like a physical blow. The crowd murmured their agreement, and he could see the suspicion growing in their eyes. They were taking a moment of courage and turning it into something shameful and disgusting. That's not true, Thomas said firmly, but his voice was lost in the growing noise of the crowd. Think about it, the merchant continued, warming to his theme. What does a dirty rancher know about fighting? What business did he have putting his hands on a noble lady? There's something very suspicious about this whole story. Within an hour, the whispers had turned into open accusations. People who had never spoken to Thomas before felt comfortable approaching his stall to share their theories about what had really happened that night. Each story was worse than the last. Some said he had been watching the road for weeks, waiting for the right victim. Others claimed he had seen the young lady in town and become obsessed with her. The most cruel version suggested that he had paid the bandits to attack her carriage so he could play the hero and get close to her. A man like that doesn't belong around decent folk, he heard one woman say to another as they walked past his stall. Who knows what he might do next? The worst part was that people stopped buying his vegetables. Families who had been his customers for years suddenly found reasons to shop elsewhere. Children who used to run past his stall now stayed far away, as if he carried some kind of disease. By afternoon, Thomas was sitting alone behind a table full of unsold produce, watching the normal life of the market continue around him as if he didn't exist, but it was worse than being invisible. Now people actively avoided him, and their avoidance was full of judgment and disgust. The town magistrate appeared at his stall just before closing time. This was a man Thomas had seen many times but never spoken to directly. The magistrate wore fine clothes and carried himself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. We need to talk, the magistrate said, not bothering with any polite greetings. Yes, sir, Thomas replied, standing up respectfully. This story about you fighting bandits, the magistrate continued, it's causing quite a stir in town. People are asking questions and I need answers. Thomas explained exactly what had happened, from hearing the woman's cries to fighting off her attackers. He spoke honestly and simply, the same way he had always spoken to everyone, but the magistrate's expression grew more skeptical with every word. You expect me to believe that a farmer with no military training defeated 3 armed bandits? I didn't defeat them easily, sir. I got cut up pretty bad. Thomas showed the bandage on his shoulder where the knife had sliced him. But I couldn't Just walk away when someone needed help. Or maybe, the magistrate said slowly, maybe you arranged this whole thing to make yourself look important? Maybe you wanted attention or money or something else from that young lady? The accusation hung in the air between them like a bad smell. Thomas felt his face flush with anger and shame. Sir, I would never do such a thing. I was just trying to help. A likely story, the magistrate replied. But here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay away from the main roads after dark. You're going to keep to yourself and not cause any more disturbances. Because if I hear any more strange stories about you, we're going to have a much longer conversation. As the magistrate walked away, Thomas realized that his act of heroism had somehow become evidence of his guilt. The town had decided what kind of man he was, and no amount of truth was going to change their minds. The next few days were even worse. Someone threw rocks at his cottage windows during the night. He found his garden gate broken and his fence posts pulled down. When he went to the local blacksmith to repair a tool, the man refused to serve him. "Don't want your kind of trouble in my shop," the blacksmith said, not looking Thomas in the eye. Even at church on Sunday, Thomas felt the weight of disapproving stares. People who had sat near him for years moved to different pews. The priest's sermons seemed to be aimed directly at him, full of warnings about pride and the dangers of false righteousness. Children began following him at a distance, calling him names and running away when he turned around. "There goes the crazy rancher," they would shout. "The one who makes up stories about fighting bandits." Thomas tried to ignore it all and continue his normal life. He tended his cattle, worked his garden, and maintained his property. But the isolation was crushing. After 30 years of being part of this community, even in a small way, he had become a complete outsider overnight. The loneliness was the hardest part. Thomas had never been a social man, but he had always felt connected to his neighbors and the rhythms of the town. Now he was cut off from all of that, branded as a liar, and possibly something much worse. As he sat in his cottage one evening, listening to the wind blow across his empty fields, Thomas wondered if he had made the right choice that foggy night. He had saved a young woman's life and possibly prevented something terrible from happening to her. But the cost had been everything he had built in this place over 3 decades. He had no way of knowing that his story had reached ears far more important than those of the gossiping townspeople. He had no idea that his quiet suffering was about to end in the most spectacular way possible. While the townspeople of Millbrook spent their days spreading cruel rumors about Thomas, something very different was happening 30 miles away in the great stone castle that overlooked the entire region. The young woman Thomas had saved was named Lady Catherine, and she was the beloved daughter of Lord Ashworth, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. Lady Catherine had not forgotten a single detail of that terrifying night on the mill road. While the town gossiped and invented wild theories, she sat in her father's study and told him the complete truth about what had happened. Her voice shook as she described the 3 bandits surrounding her broken carriage, their cruel laughter, and the terrible things they had threatened to do. "I thought I was going to die, father," she said, tears flowing down her cheeks. "Or worse. They were talking about taking me somewhere remote, doing horrible things, then asking for ransom money. I could see it in their eyes. They had no intention of letting me live once they got what they wanted." Lord Ashworth listened carefully to every word. He was a man who had seen much of the world's cruelty during his years of service to the crown. He knew exactly what kind of fate his daughter had narrowly escaped, and the knowledge made his blood run cold. "Tell me again about the man who helped you," he said gently. Lady Catherine's expression changed completely when she spoke about Thomas. "He appeared out of the fog like an answer to my prayers, father. This simple rancher who had been working late on his property, he could have pretended not to hear my screams. He could have ridden to town for help and let those men do whatever they wanted while he was gone." She stood up and began pacing the room, her emotions still raw from the memory. Instead, he charged at 3 armed bandits with nothing but a walking stick. "Father, I watched him fight for my life as if I were his own daughter." He took a knife wound to his shoulder, but he never stopped fighting until all three of those monsters were on the ground. "What did he ask for in return?" Lord Ashworth inquired. In his experience, heroic acts usually came with a price. "Nothing," Lady Catherine replied immediately. "When your guards arrived, I tried to give him gold coins from my purse. He refused. To take even one? I asked for his name so we could reward him properly. He just tipped his hat and said his name was Thomas, that he lived on a ranch nearby, and that seeing me safe was reward enough." Lord Ashworth had dealt with many men in his lifetime, nobles, merchants, soldiers, and common folk. He could usually tell when someone was lying or had hidden motives, but everything his daughter described rang true. This Thomas had risked his life for a stranger and asked for nothing in return. Such men were rare in any age. That evening, Lord Ashworth sent his most trusted messenger to Millbrook with instructions to learn everything possible about this heroic rancher. The messenger was a clever man who knew how to gather information without attracting attention. He posed as a traveling merchant and spent 3 days listening to conversations in taverns and shops. What the messenger discovered shocked Lord Ashworth to his core. Instead of being celebrated as a hero, Thomas was being treated like a criminal. The townspeople had twisted the story beyond recognition, turning an act of pure courage into something shameful and suspicious. "The man who saved your daughter's life," the messenger reported, "is now an outcast in his own community. They've convinced themselves that he arranged the attack or that he had improper motives for helping Lady Catherine. His customers refuse to buy from him. Children throw stones at his house. The town magistrate has warned him to stay away from the roads after dark." Lord Ashworth felt a rage building inside him that he hadn't experienced in years. A truly good man was being destroyed by small-minded people who couldn't recognize virtue when they saw it. It was exactly the kind of injustice that made him despise the petty politics of local communities. But Lord Ashworth was not just any noble. He held a special position of trust with the king himself. They had served together in the wars of their youth, and the king valued his counsel above that of many other advisers. If anyone could bring this injustice to the attention of the highest authorities in the land, it was Lord Ashworth. The next morning, Lord Ashworth rode hard for the capital city, a journey that normally took 2 days but which he completed in one by changing horses at every way station. He arrived at the royal palace covered in dust and exhaustion, but burning with purpose. The king received him immediately in his private chambers. They were old friends who had shared danger and triumph together, and the king could see that something important had brought Lord Ashworth here with such urgency. "Your Majesty," Lord Ashworth began, "I must tell you about an act of heroism that puts many knights to shame, and about an injustice that dishonors the very concept of community." For the next hour, Lord Ashworth told the complete story. He described his daughter's attack, Thomas's incredible courage, and the cruel way the townspeople had repaid that courage with suspicion and persecution. The king listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with every detail. When the story was finished, the king sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "In all my years of rule, I have met perhaps a dozen men who would risk their lives for a stranger without thought of reward. Most of them were knights who had sworn sacred oaths and trained their entire lives for such moments. But this Thomas, a simple farmer with no training and no obligation, he acted with pure instinct to protect the innocent." The king stood and began pacing the room, a habit he had when making important decisions, and the response of his community was to destroy him for it. They took the finest act a man can perform and turned it into evidence of guilt. "This cannot stand. What would you have me do, Your Majesty?" Lord Ashworth asked. The king's eyes lit up with an idea that was both brilliant and dramatic. "I want you to gather my personal guard, all 100 knights of the royal company. Tell them to prepare for a special mission. They are to ride to this Thomas's ranch and honor him in a way that will be remembered for generations." Lord Ashworth smiled for the first time since hearing about Thomas's persecution. The royal company was the elite of the elite knights chosen, not just for their skill with weapons, but for their character and honor. They served as the king's personal bodyguards and were respected throughout the kingdom as the finest warriors of their generation. Furthermore, the king continued, I want this ceremony to be public. Not hidden away on his ranch, but visible to every person in that miserable town of Millbrook. They will witness their victim being honored by the highest authority in the land. Within hours, the royal company was assembled and given their orders. These were men who had fought in great battles and performed heroic deeds of their own. When they learned about Thomas's story, they were outraged by the way he had been treated. To them, courage was the highest virtue, and seeing it punished instead of rewarded went against everything they believed. The captain of the royal company, a scarred veteran who had served the crown for 20 years, addressed his men before they departed. Brothers, tomorrow we ride not to battle, but to right a wrong. We go to honor a man who showed the kind of courage we all swore to uphold. A simple rancher who proved that true nobility comes from the heart, not from bloodlines or titles. As the 100 knights prepared their weapons and armor for the journey, word of their mission spread through the capital. Nobles who heard the story were amazed that the king would send his elite guard to honor a common farmer. But those who knew the king best understood that this was exactly the kind of gesture he would make. He had always believed that true worth had nothing to do with social position. The knights rode through the night, their armor gleaming in the moonlight, their banners flying proudly in the wind. They were not just going to honor Thomas, they were making a statement about what real heroism looked like. In a world where people often judged others by their appearance and status, these elite warriors were about to show an entire town what true character looked like. Thomas, alone in his cottage and nursing his wounded reputation, had no idea that salvation was thundering toward him on 100 horses. He had no way of knowing that his darkest hour was about to become his greatest triumph, or that the same road where he had been humiliated was about to become the stage for the most spectacular recognition any common man had ever received. The morning started like any other for Thomas. He woke before dawn, fed his cattle, and loaded his wagon with the few vegetables he hoped to sell at market. His shoulder still ached from the knife wound he had received that terrible night, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight he carried in his heart. As he prepared to leave his ranch, Thomas caught his reflection in the old mirror by his door. His face looked older somehow, marked by weeks of shame and isolation. The townspeople had succeeded in breaking something inside him that he wasn't sure could ever be repaired. But he still needed to eat, and his animals still needed care, so he had no choice but to continue making these painful trips to town. The morning fog was just beginning to lift as Thomas guided his wagon onto the main road toward Millbrook. This was the same road where he had rescued Lady Catherine, though. Now it felt more like the road to his own execution. Every trip to town brought fresh humiliation, and today would probably be no different. Thomas had traveled about halfway to town when he heard something that made him pull his horse to a stop. It was the sound of many horses approaching from behind him, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm like distant thunder. He turned in his seat and squinted back down the road, expecting to see perhaps a merchant caravan or a group of wealthy travelers. What he saw instead made him question whether he was still dreaming. Over the hill behind him came the most magnificent sight he had ever witnessed in his simple life. A line of mounted knights in full battle armor was approaching, their metal plates gleaming like mirrors in the morning sun. Each knight carried a long spear with a colorful banner attached, and the flags snapped and fluttered in the breeze like exotic birds. Thomas rubbed his eyes and looked again. This was no dream. There were dozens of them, maybe even 100, riding in perfect formation. Their horses were the finest he had ever seen. Powerful war animals that moved with grace and precision. The sound of their approach was like music, a steady drumbeat that seemed to make the very earth tremble. As they got closer, Thomas could see more details that took his breath away. These weren't ordinary soldiers or local guards. The quality of their armor, the precision of their formation, and the royal banners they carried marked them as something far more impressive. These were elite knights, the kind Thomas had only heard about in stories. Thomas pulled his simple wooden wagon to the side of the road to let them pass. He felt embarrassed by his plain clothes and humble cart in the presence of such magnificence. In his mind, he was just a disgraced rancher trying to sell a few vegetables. These knights surely had important business somewhere and wouldn't even notice him as they rode by, but something incredible happened instead. The lead knight raised his armored hand, and the entire company came to a perfect halt. The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear birds singing in the distant trees. The knight who had given the signal removed his helmet, revealing a weathered face marked by old battle scars. This was clearly a man who had seen real combat, someone who had earned his position through courage and skill rather than birthright. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Are you Thomas, the rancher who lives on the land near the mill road?" Thomas felt his heart skip several beats. How could these magnificent warriors possibly know? His name? "Yes, sir," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's me." The scarred knight smiled, and his expression transformed from stern authority to genuine warmth. "Thomas the Brave, protector of the innocent, defender of the helpless, we have come to honor you." Before Thomas could process what he had just heard, something extraordinary began to happen. The 100 knights divided themselves into 2 perfect lines, one on each side of the road. They guided their horses with such precision that they created a corridor of gleaming armor and colorful banners stretching as far as Thomas could see. Then, in a movement so coordinated it seemed like a single living thing, every knight raised his sword high above his head. The morning sun caught the polished blades and threw light in all directions, creating a dazzling display that made Thomas shield his eyes. "Thomas the Brave," the lead knight called out in a voice that echoed across the countryside. "The king himself has heard of your courage. You fought 3 armed bandits to save a noble lady, asking nothing in return but the knowledge that you had done what was right." The other knights took up the chant, "Thomas the Brave, Thomas the Brave." Their voices joined together in a sound more beautiful than any music Thomas had ever heard. It was the sound of genuine respect, of warriors honoring a fellow warrior, of good men recognizing goodness in another. Thomas sat frozen in his wagon seat, unable to believe what was happening to him. Just minutes ago, he had been a shamed outcast making another humiliating trip to market. Now he was surrounded by the kingdom's finest knights, all of them saluting him as if he were their equal. The lead knight continued his announcement. "The king has declared that true nobility comes not from bloodlines, but from the courage to do what is right when no one is watching. You, Thomas, have shown the kind of honor that many men spend their entire lives trying to achieve." As if the scene wasn't magical enough already, Thomas heard another sound approaching from the direction of town. People were coming, lots of them. Word of the incredible sight on the main road was spreading fast, and it seemed like the entire population of Millbrook was rushing out to see what was happening, the same people who had whispered cruel gossip about Thomas just days before were now running toward him with expressions of shock and disbelief. The merchant who had led the accusations against him was there, his mouth hanging open in amazement. The magistrate who had threatened Thomas was pushing through the crowd, his face pale with the realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation. The townspeople gathered on both sides of the road, creating an even larger audience for Thomas's moment of triumph. Children who had thrown stones at his house now stared at him with wonder and awe. Women who had crossed the street to avoid him were now craning their necks to get a better view of the rancher, being honored by the king's own knights. The lead knight raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Let it be known throughout the land that this man, Thomas, risked his life to save an innocent woman from a fate worse than death. When 3 armed bandits attacked Lady Catherine's carriage, this humble rancher fought them with nothing but a walking stick and the courage in his heart." A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to understand that everything they had believed about Thomas was wrong. The story they had twisted into something shameful was actually one of the most heroic acts their community had ever witnessed. "Furthermore," the knight continued, "let it be known that when offered gold as a reward, Thomas refused payment. When offered recognition, he asked for none. He acted not for glory or gain, but because his conscience would not let him walk away from someone in need. Thomas could see faces in the crowd changing as the truth sank in. Shame was replacing suspicion. Respect was replacing scorn. The people who had destroyed his reputation were beginning to realize the magnitude of their error. The ceremony continued for several more minutes, with each knight taking a turn to praise Thomas's courage and character. They spoke of how rare it was to find someone willing to risk everything for a stranger, and how Thomas's actions represented the very best of human nature. Finally, the lead knight approached Thomas's wagon and extended a scroll sealed with the royal crest. "This is a personal message from His Majesty the King, recognizing your service to the realm and your embodiment of true knightly virtues, despite holding no title or rank." As Thomas accepted the scroll with shaking hands, the entire company of knights saluted him one final time. Then, with the same precision they had shown in arrival, they reformed their ranks and continued down the road toward whatever important mission awaited them. Thomas sat alone on his wagon in the middle of the road, holding the king's scroll, surrounded by a crowd of people who suddenly saw him in an entirely different light. The same road that had witnessed his humiliation just weeks before had now become the stage for the most incredible vindication any ordinary man could imagine. He had walked this road as an outcast and was leaving it as a hero recognized by the highest authority in the land. The quiet rancher who asked for nothing had received everything that truly mattered: respect, recognition, and the knowledge that good deeds are never truly forgotten. The bitter wind cut through Sam Morrison's coat like a knife. He pulled his hat down lower and squinted through the swirling snow. His horse, Belle, moved slowly beneath him, each step careful on the icy ground. They had been traveling for 3 days now, and what should have been a simple 2-day ride to town had turned into something much worse. Sam was 52 years old, and until last month he had been a proud ranch owner. His small cattle operation in the Dakota Territory wasn't much, but it was his. He had worked that land for 15 years, built his home with his own hands, and raised the finest cattle in 3 counties. But sometimes life has other plans. First came the harsh summer drought that killed most of his grass. Then the terrible winter that followed froze half his herd. The banknotes came due, and Sam couldn't pay. The cattle disease that swept through. The territory took care of the rest. Within weeks, everything he had worked for was gone. The bank took his land, his house, and what was left of his cattle. All Sam had left was his horse Belle, his father's old saddle, and the clothes on his back. Now he was riding toward Millerville, the nearest town, hoping to find work. Maybe someone needed a ranch hand. Maybe the general store needed help. Sam wasn't proud anymore. He just needed to survive the winter. He had a few dollars in his pocket and 1 loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. That bread was supposed to last him until he reached town, but the weather had other ideas. The snow started falling too, days ago, and hadn't stopped since. What had been a clear trail was now buried under 3 feet of white powder. Belle was tired, and Sam could feel her struggling with each step. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was getting stronger. Sam knew they were in trouble. He looked around at the endless white landscape. Everything looked the same, just snow, bare trees, and gray sky. He had traveled this route many times before, but now he wasn't sure exactly where they were. The familiar landmarks were buried under snow. The creek he usually followed was frozen solid and covered up. Even the old oak tree that marked the halfway point was nowhere to be seen. Belle stopped walking and shook her head. She was telling him she needed rest. Sam looked at the sky. It would be dark soon, and the temperature would drop even more. They needed shelter, but there was nothing around except empty prairie and scattered trees. Sam climbed down from Belle and looked at his supplies. 1 blanket, 1 loaf of bread, and a small water bottle that was starting to freeze. He had been rationing the bread, eating just small pieces to make it last. His stomach was cramping from hunger, but he knew that bread might be the only thing keeping him alive. He led Belle toward a small group of trees that might provide some protection from the wind. The snow was so deep that each step was a struggle. His boots were old and cracked, and the cold was seeping through to his feet. He couldn't feel his toes anymore. As they reached the trees, Sam realized just how desperate their situation was. The wind was howling through the branches, and the snow was falling even harder. They were still at least a day's ride from town. Maybe more in these conditions. Belle was exhausted and needed food and rest. But there was no food for her, and no real shelter for either of them. Sam tied Belle to a sturdy branch and tried to make a simple shelter using the blanket and some fallen branches. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He sat down in the small space and pulled out his bread. It was hard as a rock now, frozen solid. He held it in his hands, trying to warm it up a little. This was his last meal until he reached town. After this, there would be nothing. He broke off a small piece and put it in his mouth, letting it slowly thaw. It tasted like sawdust, but it was food. He wanted to eat more. His body was screaming for nourishment, but he forced himself to wrap up the rest. The wind picked up again, and snow began blowing into their makeshift shelter. Belle whinnied softly, a sound of distress that Sam knew well. She was cold and hungry, too. He went to her and rubbed her neck, speaking quietly to calm her down. "We'll make it, girl," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "Tomorrow we'll push hard and get to town. Someone there will help us." But as he looked out at the storm, Sam wondered if they would even survive the night. The temperature was dropping fast, and they had no real protection from the elements. His fingers were so cold he could barely move them. His face was numb from the wind. This was the kind of weather that killed travelers every winter in the Dakota Territory. Sam had heard the stories. Men found frozen solid in the spring, still sitting in their saddles. Entire families lost when they got caught in sudden blizzards. The prairie was beautiful in summer, but in winter it was one of the most dangerous places on earth. He pulled his coat tighter and tried to think of better times. He remembered his father teaching him to ride when he was just a boy. He thought about the first time he saw his ranch land and knew he wanted to make it his home. He remembered the pride he felt when he sold his first herd of cattle. Those memories seemed like a lifetime ago now. The snow kept falling and the wind kept howling. Sam knew that if the storm didn't break by morning, they might not make it to town at all, but he had faced hard times before. He had survived other storms, other setbacks, other moments when everything seemed hopeless. He closed his eyes and tried to rest, knowing he would need all his strength for tomorrow. Somewhere out there in the darkness was Millerville, warm buildings, and people who might help him start over. He just had to survive long enough to reach them. The night was going to be long and cold, and Sam Morrison had no idea that by tomorrow evening, his entire life would change in ways he never could have imagined. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are just the beginning of something incredible. Sam was about to learn that lesson in the most unexpected way possible.